Hello, and welcome to another Talking Shop with Covering Climate Now. I'm Mark Hertzgaard. I'm the Executive Director and a co-founder of Covering Climate Now. And today's topic is the Iran war and the climate emergency. Before we get to that, some background. Covering Climate Now is a global collaboration of more than 600 news outlets and thousands of journalists around the world. We're organized by journalists, for journalists, to help all journalists do a better job of covering the defining story of our time. We train newsrooms, we host an annual awards program, we organize webinars like this one, and we build community on the climate beat. We also publish newsletters, including the weekly Climate Beat newsletter, which today carries an article by myself and one of our speakers today called The Iran War is Also a Climate War. You'll see a link to that in the chat shortly. Please go to our website, coveringclimatenow.org, where you can learn about our other partners and how that you yourself can be part of the Covering Climate Now community. Now to today's discussion. As Covering Climate Now has often noted, war makes climate change worse in many ways, and vice versa. The human costs of the U.S.-Israel attack on Iran, the hundreds of people who've died, including a reported 175 young girls and teachers killed at a primary school, are clearly a tragedy. The mounting economic risks, disrupted supply chains, rising energy prices, shaken stock markets are ominous. And the danger that this war of choice, launched by two nuclear-armed states, will escalate further, drawing in powers across the region, is alarming. Threaded through each of these concerns is the fact that modern warfare is inextricably linked with climate change. Wars unleash gargantuan amounts of planet-warming emissions. Russia's war in Ukraine, for example, has generated emissions equal to the entire emissions of 1 year of the country of France. Those extra emissions drive deadlier heat waves, droughts, storms, and other impacts that wreck livelihoods, that destabilize economies, and spur migration. And all of that makes armed conflict more likely, as the British intelligence agencies M1 and M5, M15 and M16 warned in a recent unclassified report. The climate implications of this particular war are not center of attention right now, but they are essential context for truly understanding what's at stake here. Our civilization is hurtling toward irreversible climate breakdown. In that moment, to overlook the climate consequences of three of the deadliest militaries on Earth going to war would be journalistic malpractice. The Iran war is also a climate war, and yet war has the perverse effect of pushing the climate story down the news agenda. The news media is event-driven. As we journalists know, we prioritize breaking developments and immediate threats. Wars, on the other hand, generate powerful images and dramatic narratives, and those tend to crowd out the climate story. So what do we do? That's what we're going to be talking about in this session today. We cannot cover a war that is this carbon intensive, that is this destabilizing and this consequential if its climate dimensions are treated as optional add-ons. That's what we're here today to talk about. And we have a distinguished panel of journalists to help us. I'll question them during the first half hour, and then I'll moderate questions from you during the second half hour. As always, we will take questions only from working journalists. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and be sure to put not only your name, but also your newsroom. Or if you're a freelancer, just put the outlet where your work usually appears. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can. And Covering Climate Now will post a video of the webinar after the fact for folks who couldn't join us live. Now to our panel. First, Rawan Daman. She is the Director General of Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, where she has overseen the publication of over 250 investigations, many of which have won international awards. And Nina Lakhani, she is the Global Justice Climate Reporter. Have I got that right? Global Climate Justice Reporter. Let's try that again for Drilled. Previously, she reported from more than a dozen countries for outlets including The Independent and The Guardian on subjects including state-sponsored repression and the climate impacts of warfare. And Giles Trendle. He's the former managing director of Al Jazeera English. He currently advises the international journalism project Climate and War, and he is the co-chair of the Covering Climate Now steering committee. Now, I invite all of you to please join me in giving our colleagues a warm virtual welcome. And thank you again to all three of you for being here today, Rawan, Giles, and Nina. I'm going to start, Rawan, with you. You are there in the region in Jordan, not in Iran itself. And one of the alarming aspects of this conflict is that it has been escalating and drawing in additional countries. So let's go to the slides that you have prepared that give us the very latest information on this. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thanks a lot for covering climate now for immediate, taking care of this very important topic that we are tackling today. I think it's extremely important to get that it is less than a week since this war started, and the numbers are like escalating very quickly. There is more than 2,000 strikes until like in the first few days, and 4,500 munitions dropped. I'll talk about geography because that's very important, and let's not forget that Palestine Gaza is included in this. And the human cost, as you said, Mark, is unbelievable. More than 1,300 people have been killed, and there's more than, around 100,000 now displaced in Lebanon alone. And many of our friends and community in Arij are amongst those displaced. Let's look at the map that is also expanding, including Turkey lately. So this is where the US-Israel strikes are bombing inside Iran, which is on the side of the Middle East region. I live in Amman, Jordan, that is clear on the map, and we have been having siren voices and missiles trying to attack for the last since the beginning of the war. So siren sounds, you might hear them during our webinar today because they are consistent every now and then. The area that is covering this war is immense. It covers all the GCC, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, in addition to Iraq. And now with more Israeli strikes into Lebanon, this reached even Cyprus. Just to have a quick look of Al Jazeera map that they published just a few hours ago of people killed and injured in several places in the region, of course, with more than 1,200 just in Iran. That's the biggest number, and 77 people killed in Lebanon in several places, including Beirut. There have been an evacuation in Beirut, several neighborhoods just in the last few hours. I think it's extremely important to have the context that if the global military sector, of which the US represents nearly 40% of spending, were a country, then it would be the fourth largest emitter in the world. This is responsible of approximately 5.5% of the global emissions. And a few studies have already emerged. One of them is Conflict and Environment Observatory, which is a UK-based nonprofit. They identified already 120 incidents of environment harm related to all the countries involved in the war now. It's extremely important that there was an International Court of Justice landmark ruling lately in July last year, which clearly states that to prevent climate harm during military operations, ensuring accountability for ecological damage. So climate protection is no longer something that is a matter of a political will. It's really a legal obligation, and mainly that includes states and players around the states. What I call for is a stop for this war. This is an urgent actions needed now that mandatory military greenhouse gases emissions are reporting, the recognize of ecocide as the International Criminal Court crime, and really to promote climate-focused peace diplomacy that can help us stop this war that is escalating.
Thank you so much, Rawan. That's a very moving presentation. Could you please just go back a couple slides there? I want to draw our colleagues' attention to the one more. That. Um, no, not that one. The next one. The observatory. No, I'm sorry, forward. Forward. One more. Stop. There. Uh, of course, one of our goals at Covering Climate Now with these webinars is to give our journalist colleagues around the world story ideas and leads. So this organization here, the Conflict and Environment Observatory, they're a very solid source of information. These 120 incidents of environmental harm, all of those are potential stories to look into, especially if you happen to be there in the region. And of course, make sure you're taking care of your safety and security in the region. But 120 incidents, all of those cry out for investigation, just as the human costs that are outlined in this presentation of Rawan Daman also call out for our attention as journalists. And along this line, Rawan, I wonder, could you perhaps suggest a couple of other places that our colleagues can look for solid information, especially, well, not especially, but whether they're in the region or like many of us, I'm here in New York City today, who are trying to follow this war and to do coverage around it and bringing up the climate dimensions of this. In addition to the Conflict and Environment Observatory, what are some other places that people can look, journalists can look for solid, verifiable information?
There is a double sword in this, double coins. One is there is a lot of good verified information on the climate and war lately. If you ask me, like 10 years ago, there was very few sources that concentrated on this globally. But for this exact war, there is a vacuum of information of what's happening. Because in Iran, there is a blackout, no internet, there is a big problem of shutdown of information. So if you are not within Iran, it's very, very difficult to get the satellite images right and predict what is exactly happening. The second, with all the Gulf countries, they prevented even any information going out, like people having any videos. It's almost impossible to get journalists on the ground to film what's happening in the Gulf countries, in the GCC. So open source is one of the things that we are trying to use, and with whistleblowers as well, getting the information of what's happening on the ground. It's easier now to work in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Cyprus than the other GCC countries and Iran. But we at ARIJ, the Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, we have our Arab Fact Checkers Network that is helping people verify any video that is coming in Arabic language and they would like. So I'll put in the chat also our Slack group and my email. If any journalist from any newsroom has like videos, images that they would like to fact check through volunteering 300 fact checkers from the region, we are happy to help with that.
Thank you so much. Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, we are very proud at Covering Climate Now to count them among our most esteemed partners. They're very brave and skillful journalists. Please take Rawan up on that kind offer to get your satellite data and other videos, and for that matter, any reporting. Run it by them. They are solid, they are honest, and they're fast. That all matters. I'm going to turn now to Giles Trendle. Giles, of course, you spent 19 years until recently as the managing director of Al Jazeera English. You were based in Qatar, and which of course is just across the Gulf from the Strait of Hormuz. Strait of Hormuz, those of you who are watching, if you're not familiar with that term in place yet, you're going to be. As this war continues. It's the choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's oil and gas flows, or was flowing, I should say, prior to this war. Giles, could you talk about how those facts shape the situation on the ground as this war evolves, including the war's climate implications?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I spent 19 years in Qatar, eight years as managing director of Al Jazeera English. So, war and climate, as you mentioned, they're inextricably linked. Firstly, it's the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the war machine, the military machines, the jets, the the tanks, the warships, just the whole military machine, plus the support systems of the military machine. Then you have the destruction of could be land, agricultural land, farmland, the biodiversity loss, the loss of carbon sinks, then the toxic pollutions that come from the destruction. And the report by the Conflict and Environment Observatory, which Rowan mentioned, talks about the different types of hazardous material that can be released into the atmosphere from the destruction of infrastructure, the oil facilities, the military naval bases, the military bases on site. Of course, Iran has nuclear facilities. I don't know if they're weapons, but they're certainly, as they say, civilian nuclear facilities. And so destroying these can release toxins and hazardous material that are greenhouse gases. And then, of course, there's the issue of reconstruction. Once the guns fall silent, the carbon cost is still there. If and when the fighting stops, the reconstruction has a very high carbon cost. So we're looking at very difficult times. You mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. It's the map that Rowan showed, the intensity of all the different regional aspect of this. And Mark, you mentioned the Russia Ukraine war and the emissions, the military emissions. If I can just give some figures. So in the 4 years, there's researchers found that in the 4 years, so February 2022 to February 2026, there were 312 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Carbon dioxide equivalent is the measurement by which we measure greenhouse gases. So a huge amount. Now in Gaza, there was other research which The Guardian mentioned, and I think Nina might have been involved in this, but in the first 4 months of the Gaza conflict, there were 652,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, if you extrapolate those down into monthly averages, so in the Ukraine war, 6.5 million tons of carbon dioxide per month during the war. And in Gaza, 163,000 tons per month. Now, there's a lot more carbon dioxide emissions coming during the Ukraine and Russia war. But if you take the land size, Gaza being very small, Ukraine is 1,600 times larger than Gaza. And if you extrapolate those monthly averages by the land mass, then the number of carbon dioxide emissions from military onslaught is 41 times greater in Gaza than it is in Ukraine. So that gives an idea. There's more in Ukraine, but the intensity in Gaza is interesting. So that's not meant to diminish the terrible tragedy and the emissions in Ukraine, but it does show we just need different calculations here. But yeah, emissions are a big problem, and emissions don't know any border. Climate change, climate emergency doesn't know any border. So these are going to spread across the region in Israel and the Arab world and then the Gulf. So it's not, the map that Rowan showed, those emissions are going to be everywhere. And of course, my final point, it's the same military that was pounding Gaza is now pounding Iran, plus the US military, the largest emitter of military emissions in the world. So I dread to think what sort of statistics we're going to be talking about.
Let me follow up there, Giles. I was going to ask, given that incredible discrepancy vis-a-vis Gaza, I assume that, as you say, since the US and Israel are two of the three combatants here, that we're going to see similarly intense concentrations of emissions coming out of this war. Of course, this war has only lasted for, not even a week yet. Probably a lot longer still to go. But is that extrapolation, does that logically follow? And if so, what does that mean for those of us who are journalists and we're trying to catch up to this story, especially if we're reporting from, Japan or California or Brazil? This is a conflict that is involving everybody.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think what we're seeing, I mean, the intensity of the sorties that are taking place from the American and Israeli jets and the bombing and the missiles. I imagine we're going to see something similar to the sort of intensity that would probably was seen in Gaza. The amount of destruction, of course, as you said, it's early days. I've read reports that the US is spending about $1 billion a day so far on its military onslaught. So I imagine we're going to see some big emissions coming out of this. And I think as journalists, we need to look at all the different ways that we can report that. Jets don't run, unfortunately, or whether that's the right word, but jets don't run on solar and wind energy. So the whole story of fossil fuels is at the center of this story, whether it's burning the fossil fuels from emissions to drive the military machine. It's as you mentioned, the Strait of Hormuz, energy supplies. I think there's so many different aspects to this story that you can take that are connected to the climate story. And I think it's really important that as journalists, we lay out some of those threads.
I'm going to go to Nina Lakhani in a moment, but first I want to tell everybody, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Give us your name and the name of your outlet as well. One more question to you, Jaz, on the Strait of Hormuz before we go to Nina. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. I am not in the region, but I've read some reporting coming from investment analysts and business types who talk about how yesterday or the day before, Qatar made what sounds like a pretty bombshell announcement that it is shutting down its processing facilities for liquefied natural gas, LNG, for fear of military damages. That would seem to be very big news for Asia because that's where most of that LNG had previously been going. A lot of, China and Japan in particular are very dependent on LNG. And one of these analysts said that unlike oil shipments, which you can, as soon as the guns stop, if they stop, God willing, those can continue or resume, I should say. LNG doesn't work like that. It requires at least 4 to 6 weeks to get that facility of LNG back up online. And that is you're talking about really the potential for sky high energy prices, destabilized economies, et cetera, et cetera. Can you shed any light on if that is a real concern and what's happening there?
Yeah, it's a huge concern, and I would say not just for Asia, but for Europe, because Europe takes a lot of its LNG gas from Qatar. So this is a story not just about oil, but possibly even more so about gas and the consequences that it could have in Asia and Europe. So on the first day of the war, I went to fill my car up with petrol or gasoline because I think we're going to see huge surges in prices. We're already seeing the price surge in oil already. But if this carries on, then we're going to see major implications for the prices, not just of oil and gas, but all the derivatives from it. And that Strait of Hormuz, yes, it's 30 at its narrowest point, it's 33 kilometers wide, which is nothing in when you're talking about these big tankers and ships, and you need the ships to transport the LNG. So it is a huge issue that Qatar shut down their LNG production.
So all you business reporters out there, if you're not already on that angle, there's another one to be looking into. I'm going to go to Nina Lakhani now, but one more note, please, in the Q&A, I've seen a couple of the questions. Please remember, we need your outlet name. Where do you work? And if you're a freelancer, just where does your work usually appear? So now to Nina Lakhani. Nina, you've done so much reporting on this over the years, including check out in the chat there. She was part of the Guardian effort on reporting on the climate impacts of the war in Gaza. So far in today's conversation, we've talked about the political, the military, economic implications. I want to talk more about the people implications. What are the costs for ordinary people in the region and beyond? Rawan showed us those casualty numbers, but it goes far beyond those straight casualty numbers, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. The impacts are multiple: desertification, sea level issues, drought. Iran is facing one of the worst droughts in its history. So water shortages, erratic rainfall, extreme heat, and so it's a region which is paying a heavy price from the climate crisis already. I mean, I think it's just, I want to say that I started investigating the climate impact of Israel's war on Gaza, at the end of, November 2024, right? So, very soon after they had launched their first military operation in Gaza. And I was really motivated after meeting the Palestinian chief climate officer, Hadil, at Dubai in COP28. And she said something to me, which was really what motivated my sort of investigation, and which continues to today, is that, we're here at COP. So much of the environment climate movement don't want to talk about this war that is happening in Gaza. But even if you don't care about Palestinians, even if you don't think that we have the right to exist, if you care about the climate and environment, then you have to care about these illegal wars, right? Because we are talking about huge amounts of climate, of carbon dioxide equivalent sort of being emitted, but all of the other environmental damages that have been mentioned already that sort of intersect with this, right? We know that Israel has categorically targeted water sources, food supplies, land sources, as part of its sort of, mission to make Gaza inhabitable for Palestinian people, right? It's the environmental destruction of Palestine, and I would say argue now the environmental destruction of Iran is about making a land, disconnecting people from their land, right? It's we've seen that in other places. I've reported from Guatemala. That was very much the motivation of the genocide in Guatemala as well. And so I think that the destruction of wetlands, of forests, these carbon sinks, as Giles pointed out, will, make the region increasingly hard to live in for the people who are there, and have a knock-on effect to the whole planet, right? Because all of our ecosystems are connected. All of us, we're all connected by the climate, by the environmental harms and benefits that we have. So this is a story, sort of, I think it's an absolutely fundamental story of climate justice. If you care about climate justice and you care about environmental justice, you cannot turn your eyes away from war, especially these illegal wars that are being carried out by the US and Israel across many different countries. I would argue, I know we're talking about the Middle East today, but Venezuela is another really good example, right? This isn't an illegal invasion, and I've done some reporting to Drilled on this around the legal implications for the US in conducting that illegal invasion, but also the legal consequences for the businesses, for the corporations now looking to profiteer from the oil from this illegal invasion. So there are lots of angles, as you sort of mentioned already, because these are illegal wars, and they're having direct human impacts today from the because in Iran, like I said, the water supplies are so overstressed, and now you see infrastructure being destroyed further. That in itself will trigger more conflict, right? Internal conflict. It will trigger internal displacement. It will trigger migration to other countries where there are also huge pressures on water supplies and other natural resources. So there is a knock-on sort of effect on all of this, and I think accounting for the climate. If we just think about the carbon dioxide part of it, right? Our job our roles as journalists is to hold power to account, right? We need to think about accountability at all levels. It's a false dichotomy to think, oh, we should be concentrating on the mass slaughter of children. We should absolutely be doing that, but accountability happens across all levels. And just as Ukraine, with the help of the EU, has launched a sort of a massive compensation claim against Russia for the environmental and climate damage that it has enacted through its illegal invasion. Well, the state of Palestine, Iran, Nigeria, all of these other countries that are being invaded and attacked illegally have an absolute right to do that. And it's our role as journalists to ensure that we are sort of, accounting for, doing that part of the accountability as well. Our job is to uncover all of these truths. It's not one or the other. They're all part of the same story.
Thank you. That's Nina Lakhani with Drilled. Such a powerful presentation. Nina, I'm very struck by what you're saying about the targeting, the deliberate targeting in Gaza. That's been reported. I had not seen much reporting yet on this happening in Iran. Has definitely been reported that in the capital, Tehran, they were actually talking about moving people out of the capital some months ago because of the drought conditions there. So one can only imagine. And what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that kind of targeting of environmental systems, water, food, water, land, etc., that's a feature of these wars. It's not a bug. Is that what you're conveying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one source of information for colleagues out there, the Pacific Institute based in California, they have a violence observatory specifically looking at water, the target, water as a weapon of war, water, water as a trigger of war. I've done quite a lot of reporting on that over the years for The Guardian, but that's, they specifically look at water systems. But we know that Israel deliberately targeted Gaza's water supplies, energy infrastructure, food and land and wetlands, because they told us that's what they were going to do. They told us that in the days after, in October, immediately as soon as they started invading, but they were gonna target food, water, and energy supplies. We know that's what they done. We know that and we know from forensic architecture, which is another fantastic, source of information. They've done huge amounts of work all over the world. Guatemala being one example, which I just mentioned, that we can see from their reporting and from their documentation that you have had bombs hitting water infrastructure in Gaza, for example, and then the military coming back with bulldozers to go over that infrastructure. This isn't collateral damage. This is the targeting of life-sustaining forces, which is why groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and many others, UN experts, have said that this is a genocide, because it is a targeting of what makes life livable for Palestinians. And that, when you're one other example in Gaza, there are wetlands in Gaza that are really important area for the migration of many species across the region. Those wetlands have been destroyed as well, right? And so the impact of that on the climate, on water supplies, on the dignity of people to be able to breathe and clean air, all of those things are being impacted, and they're being impacted in a deliberate fashion.
So you mentioned, and I want to emphasize it for colleagues around the world who may not know of these sources, the Pacific Institute. They're located in Oakland, California, an excellent long-standing source of very solid information. They consult with private companies, governments, UN agencies, and have done for decades. So look there. And Nina, you also mentioned a group I have not heard of, Forensic Architecture. Did I get that right? And how do we get in touch with them?
They have a fantastic website. They produce. They look at. They've done work all over the world. They, for example, were like key witnesses in the genocide trial in Guatemala. But they look at the destruction of, the physical destruction of, and document the physical destruction of farmland, of different types of infrastructure, buildings, public, schools, roads, and they, forensic architecture is it's a real speciality, but they've been around for a long time. They do fantastic work. They put out reports, but they're also really good people to go to for like expert analysis. If you're, and I think right now that would be really relevant. They do rapid response stuff, but they do lots of in-depth, sort of like longer form investigations as well. Their work on Gaza and Palestine has been phenomenal.
And where are they located, please?
I'm actually not sure. Maybe the UK. They could be actually be based out of the UK, but I'm not 100% sure. I think it is the UK actually, but okay. I'm not 100% sure.
For those of you who are interested, and if you're watching and English is perhaps not your first language, Forensic Architecture. That's FORENSIC, and maybe Nina is going to put it in the chat, so that you can see it there. Forensic Architecture. Pacific Institute, and we mentioned earlier the Climate and Environmental Observatory, I think is that. No, well, Giles, you'll have to correct me on this, or Verwan. What's the observatory's name?
Conflict and Environment Observatory.
There it is. And it's that's also referenced in the article that Giles Trendle and I published today in Climate Beat and various covering climate now outlets, called "The Iran War is a Climate War." And one of the lines that we have in that piece is very much what Nina Lakhani was just saying, that basically the outbreak of any war is, by definition, in the modern era, it is bad news for climate because of the enormous amounts of emissions that are involved. And not just the climate emissions, let's remember, but as Nina was just saying, the toxins and the destruction of wetlands and the attacks on water supply. So again, these are all storylines that all of us can be pursuing, or at least if you're writing about this, let this be important context that we convey in our reporting. So yes, what's happening militarily on the ground is important. Obviously, the human impacts and the casualties are heartbreaking. That's important. The economics of all this, what's happening with LNG out of the Straits of Hormuz, all of that is vital. But let's make sure that we thread climate through our reporting, because climate is threaded through all of these topics. I'm going to go to a couple of questions here from our colleagues. But before I do, Giles or Verwan, is there anything that you want to respond to from what Nina said that you'd like to comment on?
Yes, I'd love to. It's important in this world that what Nina said is extremely important on the genocide in Gaza and the ecocide that's happening there. Our worry is that Israel has been doing this for over 2 years and there's no accountability. Now it's doing this in Lebanon, and now the US and Israel are doing this in Iran. So our worries is connecting all of that. We are so afraid and worried of the escalation of this on the full environment and climate in the region. And I think for journalists who are searching for angles, there is the ships rerouting in the region due to what's happening. There is a huge story that is overlooked there with the fuels that is being used. There is a big story on the budget shift from the climate and green energy towards the military. There is a story there. Some people are saying it's good that the planes have stopped in the region. There's a big hub of Dubai and Doha, Qatar that stopped, and they think that this is good for the environment. On the contrary, when Corona, after the COVID, we have seen how this spike and change the whole dynamic. So I think it's good to look at the map, because many people think that Gaza is not on the Mediterranean Sea, and what is happening through the whole Mediterranean, through what's affecting the whole environment. I think we need to look differently on those stories and put them on the front line, the front pages and the big websites, and connect what is happening because it's extremely important.
Correct the dots, folks. That's what it's all about in climate reporting. Let me go to a couple of other questions. First one that came in advance. This is from Ben McNerney. He's with Iraq International News Agency. And he questions, how will this conflict affect the climate future of Iran's neighbors, particularly Iraq, where environmental degradation already poses an existential threat? Who wants to take that?
Well, if I can say, I mentioned that the climate problem knows no border. So these effects of basically these are military emissions pumping into the atmosphere are going to be creating, as you said, Mark, at the beginning, more drought, more wildfires, more floods, and those are going to happen all around the world. There's no borders to this, so it's going to happen in the neighboring countries. But also there's a case, if you're on a Pacific island, you should be looking at the Iran war and thinking, this is contributing to the climate emergency. And so another thing that might affect Iraq, Mark, you mentioned a few months ago, Tehran was running out of water, 90% down on rainfall. And this is a significant part of this was because of climate change. And it got to the point where the Iranian president was saying we have to evacuate the city temporarily. But he also said, long term, Tehran is not a sustainable place, and we need to move the capital to the coast. He said that's the long-term solution because Tehran is not sustainable as a city. Now, what you're having, you might have climate refugees from Tehran, and now you're going to have war refugees. And so where are they going to go if Iran descends into chaos? Many of them are going to be going into Iraq, possibly further afield. And that's another angle is the mass migration that might result, the refugees that might result. And they're going to be coming to the other countries in the region, possibly into Europe. And then what are the results of that? We know that refugees end up being scapegoats, and that the odious right-wing politicians end up using them as scapegoats and trying to curry and get more support. So those are other consequences that might happen.
Let
So
me
if you're
jump
having
in.
trouble convincing your editors to run these kinds of stories, that comment that Giles just made about migration, look again at the report that I mentioned earlier in this hour from the British intelligence agencies, MI5 and MI6. That's exactly what they're talking about, is how migration fuels this. By the way, that's not just the British intelligence who says this. Prior to Donald Trump coming to power in the United States, it's also the finding of the US military that climate change poses an existential national security threat. So this is not just environmental special pleading about this. This is what some of the world's leading military thinkers are saying climate change brings to the fore. Rawan, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No. I just wanted to say that it seems like we have short memory, and for young journalists, push them to look on 1990 in Iraq and 2003 in Iraq, because there is extensive studies on connecting what happened in the two wars to the climate and environment, and it has been also connected to cancer and patients. Big studies verified this. We are so worried about Iran as well because there is until now no sense of radiation. But what if the nuclear powers radiation started coming out of Iran due to the bombings?
Yeah.
Can I add one thing? Sorry,
Please, Nina, and then I'm going to go to a question from a colleague at the AP. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the internet cut out as well. I think just on your point that you're right, the Pentagon has been warning about the threat of climate change for several decades, but it was also the Pentagon that pressured Bill Clinton when he was president to pressure the UNFCCC to not include emissions in the accountability, right? So the US hypocrisy is, limitless, as we know. But I think for those of our colleagues who are in the US, in the UK, in the historically large emitting countries, which we, under international law, have an obligation to be the ones that are phasing out, fossil fuels first, and are obliged to provide climate finance for the countries that have contributed least, and provide, including reparations. In all of your reporting, whether you're reporting on extreme floods in Appalachia or flooding in the UK or extreme heat in Arizona, I think, I'm an old school journalist, so very much a fan of the nut graph, right? The nut paragraph, having paragraphs where you can write in about the contribution of military emissions, of the Pentagon itself, and the contribution, use the information that we have, which I know has a lot of gaps, but about the climate impact of the war on Ukraine, of the war on Gaza, use the EPA sort of converter for emissions for CO2, tons of CO2 to, power stations, how many power stations that equals. These are sort of easy way. It's very hard for an ordinary person, including myself, to picture what 31 million tons of CO2 looks like, right? But it means this many power stations burning for this long. Use these nut graphs to help orientate your readers, and use it every time. That we have a responsibility as journalists to be doing this. This is like 101 accountability climate journalism for me, right? And there's no reason why you can't include a couple of paragraphs in all of the stories that you're doing around climate impacts in the countries where you are.
And not just in your nut graphs there either. If you are a science reporter, one of the items that Nina just mentioned is really, I think, a valid standalone science story. Why is it that the militaries, not just the US military, but all militaries around the world, though their emissions are not counted in how much the countries have to reduce their emissions to meet the Paris Agreement goals? Now, that's weird just on the face of it, because these militaries, as we said earlier, are the fourth biggest emitter on the planet. And yet they get this pass on being included in that data. So that's definitely something that most readers don't know or most viewers don't know. So if you're a science reporter or a politics reporter or even a business reporter, that's a very good standalone story as well. I want to go now to a question from our colleague at the AP, Annika Hammerschlag. She is the oceans and climate correspondent for the AP. And this basically is asking to take the conversation a little bit further. We talked a little bit earlier about the LNG blockages there in the Strait of Hormuz. Annika asked, could you discuss the vulnerability of fuel and power infrastructure in the region? Are there any specific facilities that are of particular concern? Rawan, you just mentioned, and Giles, you did as well, the nuclear enrichment going on in Iran. And of course, never let it be forgotten that the two countries that launched this war, the US and Israel, both have nuclear weapons. But could you discuss the vulnerability of infrastructure, any specific facilities that reporters should be aware of? Giles or Rawan, either one.
Rohan, do you want to go? And I can follow up.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, all I'll say is that I've been in Saudi Arabia and I've been in Qatar, and I've seen these gas and oil terminals, and you got to think of massive 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times the size of football parks, even bigger, with hundreds and thousands of pipes and things. There are massive facilities. Saudi Aramco, Qatar Liquefied National Gas, Qatar Petroleum. Of course, you have the same in Kuwait, in Emirates, I mean, they're massive. So I know what we're seeing and what we're hearing is that drones. I mean, nowadays, modern warfare, you can have a drone that costs $10,000 being used by Iran, and it's being shot down by I know Patriot Intercept-3 missiles that are costing $500,000, $1 million a pop, and so there's an argument that Iran haven't used yet all of their facilities or all of their military drones, but just one of these drones striking one of those oil or gas installations, I could imagine it would be quite a really serious issue, and I can imagine that's why they're being shut down. But one strike on one of those facilities would be, in environmental terms, a big problem for the gas leak or the oil spill, but also in economic and financial terms, shutting these things down. So really serious risks there.
Rawan, anything to add?
Just remember the pictures we had from Iraq in 1990 and 2003, with the fires coming out of those oil places. Not to forget that there's also a huge industry that has been, developed in the full of the GCC. And I think Iran targeting the US bases there is still until now did not target those big infrastructure things. But if this happened, it will be a real big global crisis.
Can I
And
just add?
let's remember that, sorry, Nina, just one point. Remember that in war, it's like what Mike Tyson said about a boxing match. Everybody has a plan until you get hit in the face. In war, plans are one thing. What happens on the ground is another. So drones may be targeted at X, Y, or Z, and they can very easily hit one of these infrastructures, oil and gas infrastructures, and same with missiles. So let's just keep an eye out on that. Sorry, Nina, go ahead.
No, I was just going to sort of connect what Giles and Rowan was saying. In the region, people who live there already have, are having to suffer really terrible levels of air pollution because of the fossil fuel industry and the infrastructure, right? And so all of this is going to add huge amounts of pollutants. It's going to have a huge impact on air quality, potentially water quality, land pollution, which could take decades, if ever, to sort of resolve. And Rowan will be sort of much more expert in this than me, but I feel like these are like, these are really important environmental justice stories. You're gonna start to see changes in the air quality happening really quickly. And so for any journalists who are there on the ground or sort of in the region at all, I think that's a really important immediate story that people could be thinking about.
And even if you're not in the region, if you are a health reporter or a medical reporter or a science reporter, what Nina just said is a really important angle for you to bring forward to your editors and say, hey, here's a health angle on the Iran war story. Because look, we all know, and I said this in my intro, pretty much every newsroom on earth is going to go all in on a big war story like this, right? And so everybody in that newsroom is going to be looking for angles to pursue there. And here is a health angle. It's not just what these munitions and bombs and so forth do to climate in the medium and long term. It's also what is happening now to people's lungs. And in Tehran used to be one of the very top 10 most air polluted cities in the world. I'm sure they're still up pretty high, although most of those cities are now in India. So this is a great health story. So a good one to pitch to your editors. Let me switch to, there've been a couple of questions come in here in the Q&A. I'm going to combine them into one because they're all sort of asking the same thing. And maybe it's a little bit more of a hopeful angle than we've discussed so far on this. But I'm going to credit it to Dustin Blyzeffer. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, from Wyoming, yfile.com. What might this war mean for solar, wind, and nuclear energy, their industrial supply chains? And I would add, from another person's question, what about consumers? Are we likely to see a shift on the part of either consumers or businesses, et cetera, to alternative energy, not fossil fuel? And looking at the enormous risks that this war again reminds us of, the enormous risks of running a global economy on fossil fuels. So two questions there: the industrial supply chain, the supply of non-carbon sources, and how will markets respond to that? Any thoughts, any of the three of you, to that? Just speak up if you do.
I mean, I would just say that, the supply chain will be impacted because everything's going to be impacted, I think we're going to see a knock-on effect across all supply chains. The shipping industries are going to be affected, but I think whether it's directly or indirectly. So we might see that happening depending on where countries are sourcing parts and sort of equipment from. But I think in terms of, this story is, the messaging could be and should be, right, a pro-renewable story, right? If you are reliant on fossil fuels to provide large parts of your sort of energy, to source your energy grid, then you are hugely vulnerable. If you're a producer of oil and gas, then clearly you are hugely vulnerable for attack by the US, right? That's clearly the case. And so it is a prima facie case for promoting and by making a case for local democratized energy supplies, renewable, solar, wind, and I think that it sort of sounds really obvious to say it, but fossil, as you said at the beginning, fossil fuels fuel wars and they cause wars, right? And we're seeing right now, certainly with the Trump administration, going after predominantly invading countries who are oil and gas producers. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important case to be made for renewables again.
That's Nina Lakhani with Drilled. Giles or Rowan, do you have anything to add, please?
I think Nina hit it on the head, and which are of the three countries, top oil producers, Venezuela, Iran are in the top three, and which countries have been attacked recently. So I think Nina hit it on the head. Also
to attack Nigeria, let's not forget that attack over Christmas.
So, absolutely, so many other countries, but for the top three, Iran and Venezuela are in the top, as well as Saudi Arabia. Absolutely.
Rawan, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, the region, even the GCC countries were trying to do like, clean energy initiatives. With this war, we are getting those countries into square zero because we are shifting the focus into this war instead of going into the clean energy. So there is a wealth in the GCC. Instead of using it for more positive climate things, I wish for the question because it's trying to get us into more optimistic way, but it's a more pessimistic way. We are losing a chance of putting real funds from Europe, from the United States, and from the GCC into this and shifting it into the war.
Thank you. We just have a couple minutes. I'm going to close with one last question. This comes from Australia, I believe. Yes, Radio 3CR in Sydney, Australia, mentions the conference that's going to take place at the end of April, the so-called First International Conference on the Just Transition from Fossil Fuels. This is an initiative that actually grew out of the UN COP30 Climate Summit in November, where petrostates led by Saudi Arabia blocked 85 countries at the climate summit who wanted to begin to devise a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels. 85 countries were on the record for that, but the UN Climate Summit operates under United Nations rules. Those rules mandate that it is consensus decision-making. Consensus is not the same as unanimous, but it does mean that a small handful of states can block what the majority wants. That's what happened in November. But now in April in Colombia, those same 85 countries are going to be invited to a conference to pursue the same roadmap. And crucially, this conference will not be taking place under UN rules that allow consensus to block progress, but rather majority rules. So the question, with that as background, the question from Australia is, are these oil wars making it unthinkable for the world to transition away from fossil fuels? I'm going to give each of you about 30 seconds to answer that. Let's start with you, Nina.
The Santa Marta Conference is a place for countries, cities, indigenous peoples, academics, etc., to come who are ready to talk about implementing strategies and policies to transition away from fossil fuels. It isn't a negotiation space. It's a place where the idea is to make evidence-based policy on how to transition, on solutions on how to transition away from fossil fuels. So you're going to see coming together at Santa Marta, cities, states, lawmakers, peasant farmers, unions, young people who will have ideas or already putting into practice at local levels solutions from transition away. This is like, they were expecting 60 to 80 countries, like as in representations of countries to attend, but this is an action orientated conference. It's going to be the first of many, the organizers hope, and these are the countries who have said that, we have to act now. We need to share ideas and policies and strategies and measures, and we need to work on ways and how to accelerate these. So that's what the conference is going to be about. There are the majority of people in the world want climate action. They want to transition away from fossil fuels because they want to say, they can see what's happening to the planet. So I don't think it's, I think it makes it much harder for those countries, but there is a majority, the people going to this conference represent by far the majority of the population of the world. And they're going to be talking about action and implementation.
Okay, so it's not unthinkable, says Nina. And she's referencing there the 89% project of Covering Climate Now, which finds that 80 to 89% of the world's people want their governments to take stronger climate action. We're at time. Giles, Rawan, can you just weigh in very quickly to this question? Is it unthinkable for us to transition away from fossil fuels or not? Giles.
Slightly negative, I'm sorry, but fossil fuels are a way of amplifying power and projecting force at scale. And militaries are using that. Maybe that's what's behind Donald Trump's drill, baby, drill. And so conflict is increasing around the world. And until there are other sources, then I think fossil fuels are going to be difficult to tear some people away from them.
Rowan,
I'm very pessimistic these days with this escalation of the war. I think the most important for our community, journalists in Iran, in Lebanon, in Palestine, to be safe from what is happening in the countries and really not being killed by the bombs. It's very scary in all Gulf countries and Jordan. So I think it's extremely important to search for solutions, but we need to stop the war and the military using the fossil like this before we go into mass solutions.
we're going to have to leave it there. We're sorry to run over by a minute, but let me thank, this has been a fascinating and very constructive conversation with really three very gifted and committed colleagues. I want to thank each one of them. Rowan Daman with Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, Nina Lakhani with Drilled, Giles Trendle with Covering Climate Now. And on behalf of everyone at Covering Climate Now, thank you so much for being here. Send us your stories that you end up writing from this, and we will do our best to amplify them. And with that, this is Mark Hertsgaard for Covering Climate Now, wishing you all a very pleasant day.